and as Liz rightly reinforced, you know, our big piece of advice for anybody looking at increasing tobacco taxes is please don't do it without thinking about enforcement at the same time, because the consequences of one without the other are very clear from the research that we did. Would you like the microphone? Okay.
There could potentially be, you know, an adverse impact on the illicit trade side, and then you have the Laffer curve and all of that. One of the challenges we face is the data, and that's the reason I asked the question earlier, because especially when you know, are talking to government authorities and you're trying to build your argument, it's one thing to just make a generalized statement, it's another thing to make a statement and have the data to back it up. So this is one of the challenges that you know, we're facing, and particularly in some of the East African countries, is the numbers. So this is just a general observation and comment.
I mean, I think Jeremy's got some very interesting, as you're very interesting methodologies for getting at the scale of this. But I do agree with you. I mean, the one thing I would say, based on the work that we did, is when you can see the correlation so strongly across 26 countries, all of whom showed the same correlation. You can see where borders are porous, how that flows into sometimes rapid increases in the illicit trade. You can look at where borders are very porous, like in the US, and look at those flows between states. I mean, the evidence is so strong. From our perspective, it will be very difficult to build a logical argument that says there isn't that linkage. So, but if ever there's anything we can do to help as independents, because while we were sponsored by JTI and Imperial also contributed to the study, I mean, we're passionate and very convinced about this, and always very happy to work with any of the legitimate tobacco companies of the world to help make that case. Any other thoughts, questions? Hopefully you're all convinced. Thank you, Liz.
Well, if there are no more questions for Lawrence, I know he has some other work to go to. So thank you very much, Lawrence, for presenting things. And you should all get his slides after the event.
Yes, and my contact details, just as Jeremy's are, my contact details will be on the slides. We'll also circulate, Jeremy, can I just borrow that again? Not just the slides, but we'll circulate a soft copy of the report as well. It's got all the narrative and talks more about the data sources used to support the study.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Lawrence. Right, well, let's now think a bit more about alcohol, illicit alcohol, and the astounding figures, I think, that you presented for, for illicit alcohol in Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia, and I think you've also done a study in Mozambique. Yeah. So can I ask you, Jeremy, to stand up and take any questions or any comments that you have in the audience about illicit alcohol in sub-Saharan Africa?
Sure. I mean, just a comment, if I'd welcome any questions. The report that we showed you now, it's actually only a very small part of the final report that was given to our client. Because as I mentioned to you, we actually track the supply chain very comprehensively so for example, if there are molasses or fruit being used to make distilled homebrew, as I mentioned, then we show where the fruit came from, where it goes to, and the same for things like counterfeit. It's all sort of part of the analysis that we do. We haven't done a study in Kenya, as far as I'm aware. No.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. My name is Alex Oguso from KRA Research Division. My question is not actually a question, but I'm just trying to understand how you are able to capture data for the illicit trade, because some of like in Kenya, the illicit brews, they are brewed in very secretive places or down in the slums, where even accessing those places is not easy. So I'm just wondering how you are able to capture that data and to track the supply chain and be able to quantify the revenue loss due to the illicit trade and the rest. Yeah.
Yes, I mean it's a really pertinent question about the homebrew. There are different ways that we do this. One of the ways is when we work with our client, typically they do quite a lot of survey work themselves in the field. And what they do is they look at all the number of outlets which are selling homebrew, fermented, unfermented, distilled, and so on. And so they actually have quite a comprehensive picture already of how large that is, the typical sales volumes within an outlet. So that's one way. So for example, with Uganda, our client had a lot of, I thought, very good information. I mean, I can't judge how accurate the volume is, but in terms of how meticulously they listed all the different home brews and where those home brews were consumed in terms of regional preferences, what they were made from, and there are different kinds of bars for different kinds of products, and so those outlet numbers were also pretty good. But also to answer your question, just maybe going back taking back a step. I mean, a Euromonitor, and probably thinking about my presentation now, I would probably have made the legal market a bit clearer to everybody, because it's so comprehensive, you know, who the top brands are, what the main, because there is this large legal industry that we have as our benchmark to then look at the illicit market. And so when it comes to things like homebrew, we can also compare that to the legal market, and we'll use metrics like the typical population that will consume it in terms of socio-economic groups, numbers, liters per capita, compare it to other countries. So that's more like a top-down approach. And we also, we have talked and interviewed some distilled homebrew players at a local level and get a sense of how much volumes they ship a day, and kind of look at and then build it up that way as well. So there's quite a lot of different methods that go into it.
I am John of KPMG, and my question is, in presentation throughout, in most countries, it appears those people who are involved in illicit trade mostly target the poor in society and the youth. What is the reason why of targeting those sectors of the population in the illegal activities?
Why do the illicit players target them? Yes. Yeah. It's quite a difficult question to answer. I think the scale of illicit drinking, unregulated drinking, is very kind of extreme in these countries. And the fact is that young people, particularly men, want to try these products, and they get hooked on them. And I think what happens is they start off by adding them to fermented products, you know, like beers, and then they put in a distilled product, like to get a quicker impact, you know. So, but the point about the sachets and the distilled products is it's almost like they don't need to target young people because it's so widely available. And if a product becomes widely available, then young people will tend to try it. I mean, for example, I live in Ireland. I live in Dublin, which is a very heavy drinking society, as I'm sure you know. You know, it's also culturally, people drink a lot, like some of these other markets I've been looking at. But it's very, very tough regulation on alcohol drinking. You have to be a certain age, you have to show your identity card to buy it. The outlets where you can buy alcohol, the pubs, the shops, you know, it is quite restricted. But even with all of that, there's a terrible problem of drinking among young people, particularly young women in Ireland. I mean, the medical situation for young women with liver problems in Ireland, I'm talking about a regulated country, is really shocking, you know. So it's not like, oh, it's a problem here only. But if you allow young people access to this stuff, then they will take the opportunity. So.
Well, I think I can add a bit to that. Yes, the criminals do target young people where you have the regulation and retail outlets are not supposed to be selling these goods to young people. They do target the poorest, because if you're thinking about it, if you are very poor and you are addicted to tobacco or alcohol, you have to make this choice. You have not much money. Do you feed your kids and buy the illicit product to feed your addiction, or do you pay the legal price and let your kids starve? Well, most people who are poor would buy the illegal product because they're addicted and they have to have this fix, and make sure that their kids eat. So it's a real motivator for the criminals to go to the poorest in society, because they're the ones who cannot afford the high retail prices. And yet, with excise goods in alcohol and tobacco products, we are talking about products that can be addictive. So I think that's why. Any more questions or comments for Jeremy on the illicit alcohol studies in Tanzania? Yes. Someone down there?
My name is Brian. I'm a student. So you said that you follow up the illicit brews to the shops. So do you tax them from the shops, or do you follow up to the brewer? Or you tax the brewer and tax them still in the shops?
If you take a country like Tanzania or Uganda, for example, which are quite similar, I think, in terms of lack of regulation, then they tend to tax the big multinational companies, the big brewers, the big distillery companies. When it comes to home brews and more locally produced products, I think what happens is they are taxing the distributors, who are the intermediaries, obviously, between the distilleries and the retailers. and many of the stores, but not all, will be licensed, and the bars. But then there are many informal bars, or brew bars, if you like, which are really not taxed at all. So they're producing opaque beers, they're producing home brews and so on. But those premises are not being taxed at all. And I think generally the further away, the further you get from the kind of nucleus of a city, the more unregulated it is. I mean, what is quite interesting, and this was something I saw in Uganda, for example, is there were some cities where the municipalities were very strong in terms of registering businesses, both producers and retailers and bars, and really collecting revenue from them, knowing where they were. There were others that were not like that at all. So there is a lot of inconsistency, and that's a big problem as well. So, yeah. Did you?
I wanted to ask you a question on how multinationals, while they have evaded a lot of tax, yeah, and put a lot of those monies in foreign jurisdictions, yeah, I think almost, and it has been legitimized. I mean, companies like PwC, KPMG, yeah, and all these other audit firms have assisted a lot of these multinationals in tax evasion and so on and so forth, especially on illicit financial flows that have been put in tax havens across those tax haven jurisdictions and some of the islands, Jersey and so on and so forth. I've also seen local companies that have now developed that and have evaded taxes, some of the supermarket chains. I don't know how we are going to deal with this situation because it has been legitimized. I don't know how, it's a legitimate way of doing business. I don't know, what's your comment on that?
Do you have a comment?
Well, I think this is looking at a different angle of illicit financial flows. You're talking about the multinationals, and what I can say, this workshop's about particularly excise goods and illicit trade in excise goods, and there have been cases I have heard about, particularly last week when I was in Pretoria. The Swaziland Revenue Authority had identified, through excise controls on a distillery, had identified a multinational that was actually involved in transfer pricing. And they did it through excise controls, looking at all the costs and comparing with another distillery in the country. And they realized that there was something funny about the financial flows in that firm. Brought in their domestic tax colleagues and the VAT colleagues and did a thorough audit, and they found that there was a lot of financial flows through a number of countries, through South Africa, and then a holding company in the British Virgin Islands, which is a tax haven, so that the charges that were being made for the company were completely misrepresented, much lower than they should have been from the holding company, and the profits that they were declaring in Swaziland were very, very low. So excise isn't a tax on its own. You can use good excise controls on multinationals and manufacturers to actually delve deeper and find these issues when they arise. On the other hand, I would say that mostly because for excise goods, multinationals have to pay a lot of excise tax. They're more likely to be paying the right excise tax than they are corporation tax. Because usually with excise controls, you have a much more physical control as well as detailed audit control. But there is a link, and you're right to mention it. So, you know, I don't know how thorough your excise controls are, what sort of professional audits you have, and how far your excise auditors have an understanding of other tax issues and transfer pricing, because there's a lot of complexity around tax legislation for all the different taxes, and the importance of having professional auditors who understand all of these cannot be understated. I know that some countries, I know the Zambia Revenue Authority in particular, has been focusing on a professional audit approach, and that seems to be making a difference in terms of revenue. But it takes a while to build it all up, and the training, capacity building. So, yeah, it's out there, and it's up to you guys to find it. So, easier said than done, I know. Any questions about the, any more questions for Jeremy about the illicit alcohol study, methodology or findings? Yes, down there.
My name is Paul. In the course of your research, have you found any association of the increase in homebrewed liquor or illegal liquor with the high taxes that are charged on the legal liquor? Increase in illegal liquor being consumed or the homebrewed liquor, is there any association with the high tax that is charged on the legal liquor by the government?
Yes, there is a strong correlation between price increase. I mean, for example, when we did study in Zambia, which wasn't long ago, I mean, when there was a big increase in revenue, which the government suddenly hiked up prices of very popular clear beer or lager brands, there was a big jump in illicit trade. There was some trading down to cheaper beer, but also there was beer pouring in from other countries, from the borders. And so it's interesting that the smuggling cartels are incredibly sensitized and sophisticated in terms of, you know, responding to not just changes in price, but also changes in preferences for brands. So there might be a vodka brand that's suddenly very, very trendy, and then this vodka brand materializes in the big markets, the wholesale markets, smuggled in, and it's quite something to see.
Do you have any more questions or comments? Yes, the gentleman in the middle.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. And I just wanted to find out, during your research, what was your main data collection instrument?
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry. Yes, again, in hindsight, I probably should have made clearer is we first of all researched the legal market, the illicit market, and it's something that we do every year. So we have a very strong base because we have analysts in all these countries in East Africa, Sub-Sahara, and so on, who analyze and size the market for beer, spirits, wine, etc., with collaboration from companies as well to validate these numbers. So we have a good base to start off. When it comes to the illicit or illegal market, which is obviously a very, very difficult market to quantify, it's very secretive, it's a criminal activity, and so people will not be that open in explaining. the legal market, I'm talking about importers, brewers, distilleries, they have a pretty good sense. If you talk to a merchandising manager or a brand manager of across the industry, and you say, how badly is your brand affected by illegality? How big is the scale of the problem? Which brands and so on, what activities? You know, they'll talk about it for hours because they track this thing. So we get a lot of very, very detailed information from the legal market. And then it's also talking to officials. For example, if we're at the borders, surprisingly kind of honest about the relationship between seizures and products that come through and so on. So we do a lot of interviewing and data gathering directly by talking to officials. And we also, you know, we have sometimes talked to people who are involved on these in the grey market. For example, in the big, I'm sorry if you're well aware of all these things, but most of the big cities, like in Lusaka or in Kampala, they have huge markets of illegal goods where everything kind of flows through. I mean, they're like cities, you know, and there are people that will talk to us off the record, you know, drivers, shippers, and you know, they'll say, look, to this market, it's about, I don't know, 2,000 liters a day. It's this, it's vodka, it's gin. So it's very, very painstaking to build up this data. That's why it takes about 4 months, because there's so much cross kind of correlation that we need to do. Yeah. I mean, it's fun. I do like it, but it's hard work.
I guess from the questions that you don't have any methodology in place for the government for estimating revenue losses from different taxes. Is that correct? You're not using it? Okay. There are different methodologies around. Jeremy has been talking about the methodology that Euromonitor used for the alcohol market. In Europe, there is a big study that's conducted every year by KPMG called Project Sun, which is based very much, it's cigarettes, and it's based very much on empty pack surveys around all the different member states in the EU. So that's, I think, considered to be the sort of state-of-the-art methodology for illicit trade in cigarettes and tobacco products. And then there are other methodologies, such as the UK government uses the difference between taxes paid for different taxes or duties, and quantifying that in terms of either the amount of alcohol or the tobacco products, and looking at, so they've got a figure for what is actually being tax paid, and then comparing that with consumer surveys, household survey that we do every year, looking at what people say they actually purchase. And then there's an uplift of about 25% because people don't usually give the right figures in surveys. They usually underestimate how much they consume of alcohol and tobacco products. It may not be deliberate. It may be that the person answering is, say, the woman in the family, and she has no idea how much her husband drinks, for example, or her teenage son smokes. So she may be genuinely thinking that this is the amount consumed. So the focus group research has identified that sort of uplift. But that's good enough to give us a figure to base the tax gap on, and build up a strategy and get the resources from our government. So that's the key use of these surveys, persuading politicians ministers of finance, that actually we need more resources to do, if it's controls of manufacturing, it could be something that is needed with local authorities. I know that Zambia and I think Mozambique have particular problems with the local markets because those are under the jurisdiction of local authorities and revenue authorities have no jurisdiction. So although revenue authorities and customs knew all these goods were coming into local markets, they actually had no authority to do anything about it, and the local authorities refused to do anything about it because it was a political issue. There was no other source of income for the people who were dependent on this illicit trade, and they didn't want the potential social unrest if they did something about it. And it's the same issue in South Africa with illicit alcohol in townships, where everybody knows that it's happening, but nobody wants to do anything about it. And those are the reasons, because it's a poverty issue, it's an economic development issue, as well as an education issue. And the division of responsibilities in your country, if you as a central revenue authority or a customs authority cannot go into local markets where you know the smuggled product or the undeclared production is finding its way, then there's not a lot you can do. So those sort of issues can only be dealt with at the political level. So, you know, there are big issues to sort of understand and address. But certainly there are things that can be done to improve control and production, things that can be done on the policy side. I think as a result of the impact of your study of illicit alcohol in Zambia, the Zambia Revenue Authority actually reduced the tax rate on the lager and found, to their surprise, that they were getting more revenue the following year. So, you know, putting up the tax does not always result in increased revenue. And they have stuck now, I think, with the lower tax rate. And I believe there's been an example in Kenya with something called Senator Keg, where after some people had died from illegal beer, which is opaque beer, I think, that had been contaminated with battery acid or something, if I remember rightly. I can't remember how many years ago. You probably know much better than I do. That there's now a low rate for this particular lager in Kenya, which seems to be working, so far as I know, that people, if it's affordable, they'd rather buy the legal product because at the back of their minds they know that there's no quality control over illicit brew. So actually, and similarly with retailers, most people want to be honest, but sometimes economic circumstances drive them to be dishonest. So if you can find a way of bringing the people who are involved in the sale of this illegal alcohol or the production of illegal alcohol into the legal regime, perhaps with a very low tax rate or an initial withholding of a penalty or whatever, once you've actually got them in and you know where they are, you can control them. The first thing is to find out who's doing it, where they're doing it, what they're using, etc. And countries are using different methodologies. Something that has worked very well in some countries is something called a suspended penalty. When, through your observations or intelligence, you find some undeclared production or some illegal production, and you go along, probably with the police, and face the people concerned, they usually expect some big penalty, possibly a criminal action, whatever. Well, if you can say to them, okay, we found you this time, we know what you're doing, we know where you are, this is the amount of money you would have to pay, or this is the penalty that should be applied. But if you are prepared to join the regulated industry, if you're prepared to do everything correctly in future, and we will show you how, we will spend time with you showing you what is required, then we will let you off that fine. But if we find in the next 3 years, 5 years or whatever, that you are up to your old tricks or not declaring all of the production, whatever it is, then you will have not only an assessment and penalty, a fine or whatever it is at that stage, you will also have the original one added. And that could mean a criminal prosecution. And that has worked very well in some countries, that threat. Because the idea, you don't want to put lots of people out of business. What you want is to get legitimate businesses who can grow, develop your economy, and pay you more taxes, as well as producing products that are safe for the citizens to consume. So if you're thinking about enforcement action, if you can find people who are potentially likely to want to be honest, then give them the opportunity. But then when you've got the big criminal organisations and the people who thrive on coercion and corruption generally, you really haven't got any choice. And if you find them, then it has to be some robust enforcement. I know that's difficult, and I know that people are violent when there's such a lot of money involved and livelihoods are at stake. So it's not something that is ever going to be controlled. Whatever the World Health Organization says, I can't see that as long as there are high taxes on alcohol and tobacco, you will ever actually eliminate illicit trade. All you can do is minimize it. And that's why in the UK we are fairly satisfied with having illicit trade of about 10% in alcohol and tobacco products. That's probably the lowest we can get it, even with our extensive enforcement resources. We don't think we can get it very much lower, as long as we have high taxes. And there's always a balance to be struck between priorities and resources available, etc. And talking about estimating illicit trade, you can't really use seizures. Customs seizures, for the most part, in the EU, they amount to 7% of the total illicit trade in tobacco products. In the UK, they're about 20 to 25% sometimes. We try to keep it below 20%. And in several African countries, I've been informed by Interpol that we're talking about 3 to 5% of the illicit trade is actually seized at customs. That is minute. So you are facing a real problem with the flow of illegal products through your borders to the consumers. And it's not just supply, it's demand. As long as there is demand, there will be supply by the criminals. So, it's been focusing on enforcement is one thing, but also on awareness, raising awareness of the citizens of the dangers of consuming some of these products has to be part of the way forward, I think. Now, has anyone got a last sort of comment question? Because if not, it's time to move on, I think. And I'm hoping that Cara from the Kenya Revenue Authority is somewhere in the audience. She is. Where? Cara, this is your moment. We need her presentation. Yeah?
What I didn't get from you, what you didn't mention was, from the artisan brews, in your studies across Africa, have you seen a conversion by these artisan brewers to licit brewers? And is that a challenge? And number two, are there impediments for such? Has that happened? Have you found that in your studies? Is there a challenge in converting these artisan brews to licit brews as a way of raising revenue and wealth creation in these countries? Yeah, you didn't mention that.
No, I didn't. If I understood you correctly, you're interested to see the correlation between sort of artisanal brewing and commercial sales of artisanal brews, and also to what extent this process can be influenced. Is that correct? Yeah, that's a complicated question. It's a very interesting question. All the countries that we studied in in sub-Saharan Africa, so Mozambique, South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, Uganda, and so on, Zambia, they have a very high proportion of artisanal products. When it comes to distilled products, almost all of it is sold commercially. It's not made for home use because the process itself is very time-consuming, it's expensive, and it's technically complex to do. So some of that distilled homebrew will find its way, it'll just be used locally. Some of it finds its way to large-scale distillery companies who then use it to boost their own products. So there are lots of different ways that it moves. But the fact is it has a commercial end to it. With homebrew, it's very different. I think homebrew is more of a cultural, communal kind of activity. And so less of it is sold. But there is still very locally within like in South African townships, you'll have somebody brewing it in their house really and then selling to their local. I don't think that is something that is of particular concern to the government. It's not considered a big health risk. It's just, and it's considered politically quite a bad move to get involved in that because families use it to boost their income. But the distilled problem is obviously very serious. Sorry. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
I can't give a quick answer.
I'm afraid because time is pressing, we have two speakers before lunch, and the first one is here in front of us. She just told me I didn't get her name quite right, so I'll ask her to introduce herself. She's probably well known to many of you. And after that, we will have a talk from Mr. Joseph Ghana from the Cameroon Revenue Authority.
Good afternoon. My name is Karambo Modaura. I told her she did a good job getting a short form for the name Karambo because she called me Kara. That's fine. So I will take you through the challenges and successes that we've had in tracking illicit trade of excisable goods in Kenya. First, for the benefit of those who may not be from around, and also to remind ourselves, I want to give you an overview of Kenya so that you can be able to see where some of the problems that result to illicit trade come from. First of all, we share 5 porous borders. One is Ethiopia. Of course, when you have issues in Ethiopia, we have porous borders there. There are Sudan, there is Uganda, Tanzania, Somalia, and then of course we have the Indian Ocean. There has been conflicts in some of the countries, and such as South Sudan and Somalia, and because of that, of course, the borders are porous. Then Kenya is also a major transit corridor for the hinterland countries. Uganda, Congo, all the transit goods will probably go through Kilindini, get into the highway to Busia. And then Kenya is also a major manufacturing hub. For example, from Nairobi, tobacco is manufactured for 17 countries. BAT alone exports cigarettes to 17 countries in Africa. And then also Kenya has higher tax rates than the neighboring countries. A good example is The tax rate for neutral spirit in Uganda is 2,500 Uganda shillings. That will translate to around 72 shillings. And the tax rate, the excise rate on spirit for Kenya is 200 shillings. So you can imagine if somebody came and purchased spirit from Uganda and transported it, paid the taxes, and found a corridor to come back into Kenya. The transport cost plus such taxes, the taxes he'll pay in Uganda are nothing compared to the taxes he would have paid if he bought in as a Kenyan. The major illicit trade issues we have are undeclared imports. That's when you have importers who are registered, not doing a full declaration of what they have brought in, or imports made by non-registered importers. Also, we have undeclared local production, where people misdeclare. They give lower quantities than what they have produced. We also have undeclared values. You import cargo, give the wrong value. You produce, you give the wrong retail selling price. Then we have counterfeit brands, mostly through foreign production. So you'll see like a popular brand of cigarettes being imported into Kenya smuggled into Kenya. And when you follow up, it has probably been produced, it has come from, let's say, Dubai or another country. Then we have diverted exports. So domestic production, products are declared in the systems as exported, but they never leave the country, or they leave and find their way back. The challenges we've had are unbalanced tax rates in the region. I mentioned that at the beginning. We have issues of corruption. Of course, if you have corruption, either officers, the police, then it will be difficult to deal with illicit trade. We've had weak enforcement. At some point, we didn't have a strong market surveillance team. We didn't have trained enforcement officers. Let's say the police, the county officers, in the case of alcohol and tobacco. Then there is also the lack of political will to deal with these issues, of course, due to personal benefits from the leading class. Then availability of smuggled spirits also means that you have excess finished goods in the country. So if you don't deal proper with the raw material that is sold out, also you'll have a bigger problem when it comes to dealing with the finished products. Then lenient court penalties. In this case, someone will be arrested. We will see on TV, they have been arraigned in court. They have been found with illicit liquor. They have been found with fake stamps. And then they get a penalty of 50,000 shillings. That is pocket change. It does not punish. Another one, the same thing happens in a different area, and the same penalties happen. Of course, then it does not bar illicit trade. I look forward to a time where I will see the full penalty that is in the law applied. 5 million shillings, or 3 years imprisonment, or both. A situation of both, I think, would really work to deal with some of these issues. And then there are no excise stamps activations, applications in Uganda on alcohol, and also they still have alcohol in sachets, which easily flows into Kenya. Bus transport. A bus is coming from Uganda, there are cartons under seats, they are not checked, and therefore suddenly you'll have an influx of sachets of spirits in Nairobi, and a lot of them in Busia, and also import and export diversions. And someone had imported to Uganda, they find their way in Kenya, so they're dumped into Kenya. And then exports going to, let's say, Sudan. Somehow, for some reason, they pass through Uganda first, and they'll still find their way back to Kenya through a different route on the Ugandan border. So KRA has put in place certain controls to deal with these issues. One of the controls, which we can view as both legislative and administrative, is the licensing of manufacturers and importers of excisable products. So for anyone to manufacture or import excisable products in Kenya, they're supposed to have a license. And in the case of manufacturers, we don't just license a manufacturer, we license the factory, we license the production lines. So if a manufacturer needs to add a production line, then he has to inform KRA, and that has to be in our records. Then we license all their brands and SKUs. They should be able to be traced back to them. In the case of importers, we do the same. We license them, we license their premises, and anytime they want to add a new product to the list of what they'll be importing, they have to seek approval from the Revenue Authority. KRA also created the Market Surveillance Office. This was supposed to aid in enforcement. Currently, the Market Surveillance Division has about 60 officers. Before it was centralized in Nairobi, the good news is that from November 1st, that the office has been decentralized, and therefore they are able to deal with issues even in further places like Kisumu and Mombasa without incurring the extra costs of sending officers out of time every now and then. Very soon, they'll be adding to the number of officers in the division, and also we'll have more offices within the country covered by the Market Surveillance Division. There is a difference between the work the Market Surveillance Division does and compliance officers, and so this will be a buffer. And having a market presence ensures that traders are aware that at any time, an officer could get to them, and therefore it reduces illicit trade. The other one is the use of resident officers. In certain factories, especially the distillers, we have the presence of a resident officer. Their work is that they control production, they control the exports of the products. In this case, then we have less chances of spirit being sold illegally. The other intervention we've had, we have technological interventions. The first one is the deployment of excisable goods management system. And for purposes of clarity, I am talking about excise stamps. Now, Kenya didn't just get the excise stamp recently. We've had excise stamps in place since 2002. But since the stamps we had could not be traced back to the manufacturer, they could not be linked to a certain product, we worked on a system that could ensure that it gave us production accounting, it gave us track and trace, and it had enhanced security features to ensure that we do not have counterfeiting. So what happens is that at the manufacturer's premises, we do certain installations that aid us in production accounting. The installations we do are non-intrusive, and they also enable the manufacturer to keep up with his production. So if he doesn't keep good records, he's able to download the reports from our system, and he can see his manufacturing for the day. Also, the system supports effective enforcement because the information is sent to the KRA database on a real-time basis. So when the market surveillance officers are out in the field, they're able to track the goods. If they find a good in the shelf, they're able to check and see from which company produced it, and check if the stamp has been activated or the usage of the stamp has been declared correctly. Also, the system has enabled public verification. We have a smart app application, which we call SomaLabel. I'm sure many of you have access to it. So what you do is if you have an Android phone or an iPhone, you simply download an application called SomaLabel, and you'd be able to read the stamp and check whether what is declared on the stamp is the exact product that you are consuming. The police and other enforcement officers use the same app in their work. We use the electronic cargo tracking systems. This one is to control exports, to ensure that exports have actually left the country. So the goods are controlled from the factory to the point of exit. The good news is that now our electronic cargo tracking system is not just for Kenya. So once the goods leave the border, we are still able to track them to the end if goods are going to Congo, because it is now a regional tool. Uganda uses the same electronic cargo tracking system. Rwanda is using the same platform. And therefore, if goods are moving to Uganda, then the officers in Kenya and the officers in Rwanda have the same visibility of the cargo. We have introduced a modern tax management system known as iTax. iTax is the major platform for tax declaration, basically the tool that is used by domestic taxes department officers and by the taxpayer. Through iTax, taxpayers file their excise returns, and from the information given there, then we are able to monitor tax payments, we are able to do a trend analysis, we are able to see what then, if there are any changes, then we are able to ask the taxpayer or the manufacturer what went wrong in this month, and also to do industry checks. We are also able to cross-match information. So if someone has declared a purchase from you, and then you must also have declared it as a sale on your side. And therefore, this helps us to ensure that there is tax compliance. We also collaborate with the industry. We engage the industry through their bodies. For example, the Kenya Association of Manufacturers, ABAC, that's the Association of Alcoholic Beverages Association of Kenya. We work together with them to work on strategies for enforcement. They give us information on any intelligence that they gather from the field. They give it to us and we are able to act. We also sit down and work on areas which they feel they have issues and they need assistance from the Kenya Revenue Authority. So we have a really good working relationship with the two bodies and others. We also have intergovernmental agency enforcement. For example, last year, the president announced that he needed a crackdown on illicit alcohol. And KRA, together with other bodies, such as KEBS, such as the Anti-Counterfeit Agency, the Ministry of Health, the Police Service, worked together to vet the companies that were registered or licensed as liquor manufacturers. Everybody had to be registered afresh. And the surprising thing is that out of the initially 176 or thereabouts companies licensed, they were struck down to 26. Yeah? So that will tell you that a lot of manufacturers who want to deal with illicit trade will apply for a license for cover. I think that was mentioned here earlier, that there are people who hold a license just as a sign that, but I am a licensed manufacturer, but they are actually engaging in illicit trade. Now, the interesting thing is that during this period, when we got just about 26 manufacturers, excise duty went up by about 8 billion. So that should tell you where the 8 billion shillings was. So the introduction of EGMS actually assisted KRA deal with this gap. We also have a single customs territory where the same three countries, Uganda, Rwanda, taxes are paid at the port before they exit. If they are getting into Uganda through Kenya, then they have to pay the taxes where the goods are at the port at Kilindini. And also, before the goods are released from the factory, then the taxpayer has to pay taxes before they can move to the other country. We've also had international cooperation and experience sharing. We host a lot of countries to give our experience in fighting illicit trade. We also attend other meetings where other countries are giving their experiences. We collaborate a lot, especially with Uganda and Rwanda, as mentioned earlier, especially when it comes to dealing with the issue of neutral spirits. There's a class of people we call the regional importers of neutral spirit. Those are purchasers from Tanzania, from Rwanda, from Uganda. Before they can purchase neutral spirit from Kenya, we have to know that they are actually licensed to deal with the commodity in their country and in the quantities, that they are able to deal with the quantities for which they are purchasing. That has helped a lot to ensure that illicit trade both in Kenya and in the neighboring countries on spirit has gone down. On legislative controls, the tax structure was simplified through the Excise Duty Act of 2015. It came into force on 1st December 2015. Excise taxes are mostly specific now. So instead of having the hybrid, which we were used to, which was really a complex tax, most taxes, which you have a common unit of measure, have a specific tax. The ones that don't have are the ones that you cannot really say it has to be a kilo of a cosmetic or a liter of a food supplement. Everything else is really specific. Then through the Legal Notice 53, which is the Excisable Goods Management System regulations, it has brought clarity on the obligations of everyone in the supply chain. The obligations of KRA are well spelled out. The obligations of the manufacturer are well spelled out, which includes letting KRA know when there are production lines that are not running, affixing stamps, and declaring the usage at production. For importers, which include being licensed and which include affixing and declaring usage of stamps within 5 days of clearance at the port. Also, there are obligations of the distributors and the retailers that before you accept excisable goods in your premises, you must verify that they are correctly declared. Otherwise, there'll also be penalties on your side. This solves the issue whereby manufacturers would say, but some of those products don't come from us. A distributor will hold goods from many different manufacturers. Maybe another manufacturer got fake stamps for my goods. And therefore, the distributor has to check everything that is brought to them, and therefore they take personal liability for any non-declaration, for any fake products and fake stamps. The successes we have had is that there is easy detection and seizure of illegal cigarettes, beer, spirit, wines, or the goods that are currently under the Excisable Goods Management System. This is because it is when the officer checks, he gets the information real time through the device that he uses to check the stamp. Beforehand, when we had the stamps that you could not track and trace, then you'd have to take the stamp, check in manual records, take it to the lab, and then when you go to court, you ask, so how was the manufacturer supposed to know the difference? So now we have 100% prosecutorial rate. Everyone that is found with illicit products can be dealt with because you have real-time information. Then over 20 million cigarettes have been seized over the period since we introduced EGMS, that is since 2013. Also, a lot of illicit spirit has been seized and destroyed. There has been steady growth of excise revenue through the period since we introduced EGMS. And in the year 2014, just the period when, after we had just introduced the excisable goods management system, the excise revenues on imported cigarettes went up by 4,728%. It may not be too large compared to the local taxes, the taxes paid from domestic production, but this is really big. That should tell you that a lot of cigarettes were coming into the country without being declared. Then we have business intelligence for effective intervention through the use of technology, through iTax, through EGMS, through ECTS. As I had explained earlier about illicit trade on spirit reducing and excise revenue rising. So in the year 2015-16, it rose by 4.4, and the last financial year by 8 billion. That just happened by dealing with spirits. Then we have had closure of non-compliant manufacturers. So 3 manufacturers of tobacco shut down, 150 manufacturers of spirits shut down, and then we've had a reduction of the importers of tobacco into the country. So what lessons have we learned as we have been trying to fight illicit trade? That first we must deploy multiple measures against illicit trade in order to deal properly. Licensing is not enough. As we said earlier, that people have a license but they still deal with illicit trade. So you must have licensing, you must have the excisable goods management system, and because terms are just applied on domestically, on goods to be consumed locally, then we need the ECTS for dealing with exports and for dealing with transit goods. So there is also need to extend the track and trace systems to the first buyer. So currently, all we have is production accounting and track and trace, but there are plans in the future to ensure that the manufacturer is able to put the first user in the system. That's in line with the requirements of Article 8 of the protocol to eliminate illicit trade against tobacco. And it will also serve well for the manufacturer, as when systems are integrated, then the information in GMS will just populate into his iTax return. And also we'll be able to compare the information in eGMS, and also if they make any changes in the return, then we can tell where the problem is. Then there is also the need of standardized tax rates in the region, especially for spirit. As I said earlier, the difference in the tax rates for spirit in Uganda and Kenya is a whole 138 shillings. And for Tanzania is around 32 shillings. That's also quite a big difference for a large consignment. Then there is also a need for regular sensitization for all enforcement bodies, the police, the judiciary, the county officers, the anti-counterfeit agency. There is need for regular sensitization, even for KRA officers, so that people do not lax in the good work that they are currently doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cara. That was a very quick run through all the things you've been doing in the KRA, but I think you're right to say that you can't be complacent. There's lots more to do, and yeah, one of the things that struck me is you talked about enforcement. What about awareness, general education of the public, awareness of the difficulties? But I'm sure there's lots more you can do. Now,
we actually conduct a lot of sensitization.
okay. Okay. Well, Cara, if you didn't hear, Cara was just saying that you do actually conduct a lot of sensitization programs locally, which I hope will help. Now, I don't know if you have any questions or comments for Cara. We got 1, 2. Can we take those 2 quickly and then move on to our final speaker? Because I'm sure you're all getting quite hungry. So,
Good afternoon. I'm called Winnie. I have a comment on the use of a modern tax management system. I think KRA's, the iTax, is a bit complicated. You should copy what Safaricom is using. You don't need to complicate things. Simplify your systems so that you can be effective in the collection and monitoring of the tax payments. You can even use the USSD code instead of going to download the P9 forms and filing back your tax returns. Because I think the informal sector that is paying tax does not even have internet to download the P9 forms. So you need to copy what Safaricom is doing. And they don't do trainings, actually. You just ask your neighbor and you're done. So you simplify the systems that you're using.
My name is again John Mureithi of KPMG, and I want to thank the presenter for a good presentation. However, I just want her to clarify whether they are facing any challenge on excise on financial services, because financial services is also exercisable since recently, and I just want to know whether there is any challenge that KRA are facing on that area. Thank you.
Well, thank you. My name is Jackson, Ebro TV. Okay. One of the challenges, or some of the challenges that the carrier is facing is the undeclared local production and counterfeit brands. Okay, as a business reporter, I came to find out that some of the complaints that business people have is the long bureaucracy in registering companies and all that. That's why sometimes you see these guys doing shortcuts. They hide behind their businesses and they do illegal businesses. So I just wanted to ask what have you done to simplify such processes so that we can see more business people can register and see this taxation process easier and more convenient. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have to stop there with questions simply because of time. Can we ask Cara to give some comments, please?
Winnie, on the simplification of the tax management system, that's a well-taken point, and I will pass it forward to the concerned persons. But I want to make a clarity on what I said about integration of systems. In this case, for excise, I said earlier that if we manage to have the details of the first purchaser, then all we will do is that information will be pushed down from the EGMS system to the iTax system. You know the way when you're filing your end of year return, you find information done by your employer? That's the same thing that we want to happen at the end of the month for the taxpayers. Then on to Mr. Moredi on the challenges, on whether we face any challenges on excise on financial services. Yes. And the biggest problem with financial services is that people are actually not aware. So the thing that we really need to do on this is a lot of taxpayer education, especially to SACCOs, and especially to SACCOs. That's the biggest problem. Jackson, on undeclared local production, there are people who will just not declare, even when they have licenses. That's what we are calling undeclared local production. Any other production, that's illegal production, those who are taking shortcuts. But the processes of licensing now are pretty simple. We don't need the taxpayer to walk into Times Tower with a load of documents. He just goes to iTax and completes a form there, and then the email he gets is complete on what information he needs. So he'll not walk into Times Tower today, bring documents, and then tomorrow he's told bring document C, bring document F. The processes are pretty simple. We will not conduct an interview today and then what do you call them? The factory visit tomorrow. We combine them at the taxpayers' premises to make life easier for them. And immediately a taxpayer gets a license, their information is input into EGMS and he's trained on how to use the system. Also, we do regular sensitization on the system use. When there are any changes, we communicate to the taxpayer and we train them if need be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kara. I know that there are other questions. If we have time at the end, then we may be able to raise them, but I'd like you to welcome now Mr. Joseph Ghana from the Cameroon Revenue Authority to talk about the challenges and successes that the Cameroon Revenue Authority have had in dealing with illicit excise products. So, Joseph? You want the seat? Okay, well you can have the seat, but I'm not sure whether that will work without the gadget. But have the seat. Have the seat and the...
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Madam Liz, for the moderation. I just want to say that the expose of Madam, her presentation, as far as the challenges are concerned, are very similar to what we have in the CIMAC and some countries of the West Africa. So for purpose of time constraint too, I would not like to repeat all of what she has said, but I think that they are similar to what we have. But if we look at the excisable products that we have within the CIMAC sub-region, Cameroon, and some countries of the West Africa region like Nigeria, we have alcoholic drinks, cigarettes, telecommunication of recent, some environmentally unfriendly goods like packaging, and then of course general contraband products, sugar, even though sugar does not draw excise. I think that Kenya has gone a long way as far as the issue of combating the illicit trade in excisable products are concerned. From the presentation of Madam, we still have a long way to go. You can understand that we are coming from a region where revenue diversification was not the order of the day, has not been the order of the day till now. Because most of the countries around CIMAC region were countries that rely heavily on oil revenue. Some countries have about 80 or 90% of their revenue financed from natural. Okay. Okay, thank you. Some of these countries have about 80, 90% of their revenue from natural resource. For example, Equatorial Guinea, you have Chad, you have Congo. So the other sources of revenue were not much of concern to them. And this has played very much to a country like Cameroon, which has been trying to make effort to diversify their sources of revenue. If we take the case of the relationship between Cameroon and Nigeria, as far as that is concerned, I remember when we had the drop in the value of Naira comparatively to the exchange rates of the other countries, we had a lot of difficulties controlling products that entered from Nigeria to Cameroon. The first thing is that there was a very unlawful competition between domestic producers and these products that are coming from neighboring Nigeria. So the fight against illicit trade did not come out of the initiative of the tax administration or the customs administration. It came as a result of pressure that was put by domestic producers. And one other thing I want to highlight, which is a bit different from what Madam said, is the fact that in our country, most of the countries around have a French inspiration of their revenue administration. What do I mean by this? We have the customs administration and the tax administration completely independent. And that has been a source of very difficult collaboration between the two administrations. It's really a source of problem. But when we have all the administration under one umbrella, it is easy to coordinate activities as far as revenue mobilization is concerned from both sectors. Another major challenge that we have is that of law enforcement. It's really a major challenge because we have had instances where smugglers, containers of maybe cigarettes have come into place, and the administration has taken this person's consent to courts. But at the end of the day, as Madam said, a lot of media announcements come up and a lot of mass communication, but at the end of the day, you see those persons as free as if nothing had happened without paying any considerable amount into the state treasury. So it's a real problem to us. Another aspect is, as I said, the porous borders of these nations, very porous in such a way that it's difficult for the customs authority to be at all the different ends and to check these products. So we get the market flooded with most of these excisable products. Another issue is the high tax. The high tax in terms of domestic products. I take the case of the sector like drinks, even sugar. As a result of this high tax, it's a disincentive to consumers. And that makes contraband or smuggled products very, very attractive because they enter into the country very cheap. Custom duties are not paid. They use other different routes. And it becomes very, very difficult for the domestic production to be able to compete as far as the pricing is concerned. So that is a serious handicap too that we have. But in terms of some measures that have been taken, we have, first of all, the Ministry of Finance that signed a convention with the military. It's very important. With the Marine Service. The Marine Service, they are doing a constant surveillance of the waters, because most of these products do come through the air. I mean, by sea. I think Gabon did that too. And it is doing a lot, especially when it comes to fuel products. Fuel that is sold offshore in the deep seas is VAT exempted, and other duties, including excise. So it becomes very lucrative if it is carried and transferred by water to another destination. So, but the military has been doing a lot as far as the seizure is concerned. The Ministry of Finance too has signed a memo of understanding with the judiciary and the police in such a way that we have a platform of collaboration as far as fighting against illicit sales is concerned, or as far as revenue mobilization is concerned in general. What we notice is, at times at the level of the judiciary, some cases don't prosper, not because of bad faith, but because of the fact that the judges do not really understand the stakes as far as the fiscal law is concerned. It's important for us to precise that we don't have in our system the tax courts. So it is the civil judiciary that is in charge of even handling tax matters. So the specificity of tax matters is not at the reach easily of the judges. But we have signed a platform that permits us to be able to have regular exchange with the law enforcement officers as far as the fight against illicit products are concerned, and beyond that, other matters of taxes. Another major issue that we have is the non-harmonization of the legislation of member states. I think CEMAC is just trying to come into that. Even in West Africa, that problem is a major one. Every country has its own disposition, whereas if we have to fight the illicit trade in this region, it is necessary to have a harmonized rate, or to have a harmonized system of coordination amongst these countries. I think CEMAC is going towards that now, because of recent, CEMAC has been trying to do some training to tax officials of coming from Chad, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, and Cameroon. I think, as I just said, before this time, CEMAC was more concerned, as far as fiscal policy is concerned, with the expenditure part, because revenue was not a problem. Money came from natural resource. But from 2014, where the tide has turned because of what we know as the commodity shock, and with the intervention of the IMF, diversification of revenue has become very, very predominant. So issues of excise duty, which did not take a very important place before in some of these countries, have become a point of major concern, because even the IMF technical team has given that as a conditionality. So the political will has developed obligatorily, and we are sure that with this political will, much avenues will be touched to be able to protect the domestic industry, counteract this counterband, fight against smuggling, so as to have available form of resources from this sector. We just introduced, most of these countries have just introduced, as of 2015, the excise on telecommunication. It is 3% of the consumption. It is true that, especially in a country like Cameroon, it made a lot of noise, because automatically the telecommunication expenses had to increase. But in connection with the Ministry of Commerce and that of Post and Telecommunication, there was an interministerial circular that has been signed to that effect. And gradually, the consumers have come to understand that it is of absolute necessity for us to pay this tax if we want to contribute in the realization of the budget. I think the IMF even gave a proposal that the tax should move from 3 to 5%. But because of the civil society reaction, because of the reaction of the authorities of the Ministry of Commerce, the Ministry of Finance decided to hold this 3%, and first of all, get the communication companies adapted to that before we can subsequently see whether it is feasible to increase the rate or not. So, briefly, I think that those are some of the measures that we have taken to be able to counteract this issue of excise. First of all, mobilize the revenue that is already, the tax base that is available. And secondly, to be able to fight against the illicit trade of excisable products. So briefly, that is just the resume I wanted to get. I did not want to go back on the causes, the factors, and all of that, which Madam had highlighted. So that said, Madam, thank you. We are open for questions if there are any particular clarifications. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Joseph, for sharing that with us. I know that one of the themes that has come up has been the difference in tax rates among different countries, and I would suggest that you take a look at the Southern African Development Community excise guidelines. They're available on the SADC website, and they have been agreed among the 15 SADC countries as a voluntary way forward to try and achieve more standardization across the excise regimes, covering policy, processes, administration, etc. So I suggest you take a look at those as a possible model for the East African community or the West Africa, Central Africa to look at as well. Some of the things that Joseph said struck home with me from the recent work I've been doing with the SADC countries, and that is now so many countries are turning to taxing airtime or telecoms, as well as sugar in soft drinks, moving away from the original idea of excises as sin taxes to excises particularly as revenue earners. And these are quite new sorts of taxes. You mentioned excise on financial services, someone did earlier. So these areas are now coming into excise because they are seen as revenue earners for countries concerned. And I think that's a whole new set of issues are coming up. And certainly I know from those in some of the SADC countries where they're trying to audit companies with dealing with telecoms and airtime, a lot of difficulties have arisen, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of learning to be gained over the next year or so from the countries who've introduced tax on airtime. I know, for example, that the Zambia Revenue Authority had to change legislation. It was originally on telecoms, and they now make it on airtime because of some difficulties in actually defining the full content of the services. And a lot of hostility, I believe, was encountered from the telecoms industries themselves about this. So that was quite interesting, Joseph, hearing about your initial experience with telecoms and the pressure to keep the tax rate low. Now, we've come to more or less the end of this session. I'm sure because there are so many people here, you all know that excise is very important to all of you. And I'm sure you will have more questions and comments to make. Now, Cara, I think, is still here somewhere. Yes? And we'll be available to answer more comments and questions during lunchtime. Yeah? Joseph, similarly, is available for questions and comments. But because we are, I think, getting quite hungry, and we can hear the noise of everybody out there eating, I would like to call on my boss, Mr. Dan Witt, to come and close this session. I've given my card out to lots of people, but more people have come in and I've more or less run out of cards. But you can contact me through the International Tax and Investment Centre, and I'll be happy to provide information. There are lots of resources the International Tax and Investment Centre has on excises, a booklet on fighting illicit trade in tobacco products from 2013. Still a lot of information in there that are going to help you. 2 toolkits, one on standards to expect in supply chain controls within a well-run firm. Know your supplier, know your customer. Another one on controls that should be in place in free trade zones. And that's another issue completely that we could spend a day on. And one on introducing a specific tax on alcohol products. Now, I was very pleased to hear from the KRA has now got mainly specific taxes for excise because they are easier to control. So lots of things, I think, from the speakers, from Mr. Turper about the benefits of comparing customs and revenue authority data, particularly if you're looking for underground producers of cigarettes or alcohol. If you can get feeds from your custom systems to the revenue authorities of all those importations of key inputs to production, for tobacco products that could be filter papers, etc. Oh, I've just been told we've got another half an hour before lunch. I'm sure everyone's stomachs are rumbling and you're all desperate for more food. So we do have a little bit more time, if you want. So, yeah. Key inputs from custom systems. You can get feeds to revenue authorities of who is importing things like cellulose acetate tow, which is a key input for cigarette production, filter papers. There are many producers of cut rag and raw tobacco in the area, and that's another issue about how you control those. Production equipment. Hopefully you're not allowing any seized production equipment to go back onto the marketplace, so they are actually destroyed together with seized product. And I know several countries actually auction off things in order to get money for the revenue authorities. But of course, any second-hand equipment is likely to go into underground production, so I hope you're not going to be doing that. On the alcohol side, if you're producing alcohol products, you're going to need bottles, labels, bottle tops, all of those sort of things. Some of them will be imported, so a feed from the customs data on who is actually importing these goods can lead you to find undeclared production. So that's a few things. Now, people did have more comments and questions, so we have got time for that unless you're all desperate to go for lunch. Any more comments and questions? Yes, I understand, but I think people are hungry. Well, nobody is putting their hand up, so I think you are hungry. I would say I have two presentations that I haven't given today because of lack of time. They will be circulated to you. One is about the development of modern revenue controls, and it's a study of the use of tax stamps and other track and trace products in different countries of the world and how effective they've been. And this study was done a little bit before, well, I think it was 2014, 2015 data. So we did have some information on the start of your new tax stamp system in Kenya, and be very interested to see how this continues to develop. I mentioned earlier track and trace, that having an international standard and products accredited to the international standard is the future, and paper tax stamps, unless they're going to be read across countries, and I appreciate they can be read across your region, but what about the whole of Africa? Things come through from the SADC countries into Tanzania and then presumably into the EAC, because Tanzania is a member of both groups. So I don't know how you deal with that, but think future digital identifiers and interoperability as for your mobile phones. So with that, I'd like to ask Dan to come up and close it if nobody wants to discuss anything further. Dan.
Well, Liz, thank you, and congratulations on another fine workshop. And Joseph, excellent insights. And where did Carol disappear to? That, I mean, those are incredible statistics. I mean, it shows that the system you put in place worked, and it'll continue to work because you've got those measurements, and you're able to hold your people accountable. And I find that it's easy to talk about this stuff, but unless you have those key measurements and look at it every month, every quarter, you'll think you're stepping on the illicit trade only to have it come back. So just a couple of wrap-up comments. I hope one of the things that was apparent from today's 4 hours was the importance of dialogue. I mean, you cannot successfully, efficiently, and productively combat illicit trade without it being a collaborative effort between the legal trade and the government enforcement authorities. So it has to be a collaborative effort, and I hope that those are ongoing dialogues and consultations that are happening in your countries. And I hope the second point that came through loud and clear was the necessity to have fact-based analysis. Fact-based analysis to support your policies. And that sounds quite obvious. It's obvious in most areas of public finance. But what I find on the excisable goods, with alcohol and tobacco, they're often driven by emotion. You've got the civil society people, you've got the health advocates who are excellent at doing health, but they're not public finance economists. So you've got to keep the facts driving these debates, driving your policies, not the emotions. And that's particularly important for the ministries of finance to continue your leadership role on all excise tax policy, administration, and enforcement issues. Of course, you need to consult with your ministries of health. With respect to raw tobacco, you need to consult with your Ministry of Agriculture. But you need one Ministry of Finance in the country. You need one tax body. And, you know, I know it's controversial in some countries, but I share the view, ITIC shares the view of the IMF, that earmark taxes, while they may make good politics, they're bad economics. So we encourage you to have the excise collections come into the general budget and then be allocated back out as part of your budget process. I think about the debate, the broader tax debate going on around the world. The G20, the UN, at the IMF, World Bank annual meetings. And the two things that keep popping up as priorities are fighting the illicit financial flows, and then, of course, how do we mobilize domestic revenues? And excises, I think back to my dear colleague, Professor Knausen. He said this in the early 2000s, when we were preparing for a conference in 2002. He said, excise taxation is the stepchild of public finance. You know, it's looked at as not being sexy. People would rather work on transfer pricing or taxation now of the digital economy. Those are kind of the sexy things. Before, it was taxation of financial services was, up there as one of the hot items. But if you think about the illicit financial flows, just from listening to Joseph and coming in and hearing the end of Carol's presentation, those are enormous. Those are quick wins. I mean, think about the fights with companies on transfer pricing, and they can be 2-3 years and end up in court, and you may get nothing. And then you think about mobilizing domestic revenue. I mean, the staggering revenue growth statistics that Carol had on her slide. Those are quick wins, ladies and gentlemen. And if you're not an oil-producing country, those are meaningful contributions to your budget. And as Joseph said, as even the oil-rich countries have realized as prices have fallen, these are important revenues. And I remember a discussion years ago with the Deputy Minister of Finance in Russia about tobacco excises, and he said, don't worry, it's a rounding error when you had oil prices of $110 or higher. Well, believe me, Russia's not looking at these things as rounding errors today. And I also want to remind you of, consistent with my point of the importance of the leadership role that's essential by the ministries of finance, because these issues unlike income tax, unlike VAT, you're balancing many, many objectives. And every one of the other of your colleagues in government think their objective is the most important. But you're balancing revenue objectives, health objectives, law enforcement objectives. And in some countries, and with alcohol, you know, there are agricultural objectives that are often tied with a differential rate. And of course, employment objectives. Those need to be balanced. There are political decisions as to which is higher or lower, but all of those need to be considered and weighed in your policy-making calculus. Then when it comes to enforcement, you don't have competing objectives. The objective then is to support the legal and fight the criminals. And my last point, Joseph reinforced it, and I don't know if it was a resource, Liz, it was a 2012 article that I wrote with Adrian Cooper from Oxford Economics that was published in the World Customs Journal. And the title was something like, "The Linkage Between Level of Tax and the Illicit Trade of Excisable Goods." And we had collected a range of data from advanced economies as well as developing economies, and it was the same correlation. The higher the level of tax, the higher the level of illicit trade. So a positive correlation. And I urge you to don't ignore the laws of economics. If you reach too high, too fast, and create a tax shock, you're going to create a demand for the illicit product, whether it be illicit beer, or illicit cigarettes, or illicit whiskey. If you make those products unaffordable for the consumer, that creates demand for the illegal product. Now, that's a bit of a conflict with your health colleagues whose purpose often in life is to make these products unaffordable. They think they can use tax as almost a quasi-prohibition. And that may be true, but only for the legal products, not the illegal one. And I think we all are smart enough to know how smart criminals are. If they smell money, and they're going to chase it, and they're going to get it. So if you overreach on taxes, that basically is increasing their profit margin. And that's money that goes in the criminal's pocket, not in the government's coffers. These are the fundamental laws of economics. I think we may be in an economic classroom looking at that board. You know, the basic rules of supply and demand. And as good as your enforcement is, you still need to use those laws of economics to help you. And Liz, again, I want to congratulate you on a successful workshop. We've got a wide variety of resources that are available on the internet. I look at one of ITIC's purposes in life is to connect people and resources. And I hope that this can be the start of an ongoing engagement, whether we are together again, and I expect we will, face to face, but also through your using our resources as you move forward in looking at policy reforms or how you can strengthen your administration or enforcement. So thank you very much for your very kind attention as your stomachs are rumbling. And Liz, congratulations again.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm going to leave you with a little quote from Adam Smith, who said in 1776, "Not many people are scrupulous about smuggling when they can find an easy and safe opportunity of doing so." It's your job to make sure they don't have that safe and easy opportunity. So good luck, everyone.